Thank you so much, Penny. I'll get going soon. It's just so lovely to be here. Now look, those of you who know your British history will know that in 1788 you sent out to this new country called Australia convicts. And I bet you're looking at me and thinking, I wonder if she's descended from one of our convicts. And I'll tell you what, I wish I could say I was, because people at home, when they find out that one of their ancestors was a convict from the early fleet, they wear the badge with such pride, you know. But I want to tell you nothing so exciting for me. My father, a few generations back, his ancestors were Scottish, and my mother was born in this country. See, I'm one of you. My mother was born in, do you say Holborn? Is that how you pronounce it? Holborn? Anyway, there. And listen to this, my grandmother was Cockney. And I just, look, until the day she died at 97 years old, you couldn't miss that she was Cockney. You know, it was just, anyway, I'm very proud of that part of my ancestry. Well, now look, I want to tell you right at the start that I have a vexed relationship with the democratic principle of freedom of speech. And that's really what I've been asked to talk about today, is free speech, fair speech, the topic of my latest book, which, you know, there are copies there if you want to get one. You see, on the one hand, freedom of speech, on the one hand, I would rather live in a country that has freedom of speech as one of its central principles than anywhere else on earth, because as a radical feminist who regularly speaks out against injustices, I have the assurance that I can do that I won't be arrested, I won't be killed. So to have freedom of speech as one of our central principles is so important to me. On the other hand, the principle of free speech has been co-opted and distorted almost beyond recognition to justify all kinds of repressive speech and behaviour. So I have this kind of vexed relationship with it. Let me illustrate the kinds of distortions and the resultant confusion that exists around our right to free speech with an example relating to Indigenous Australians. A few years ago, one of Australia's most conservative reactionary journalists, Andrew Bolt, wrote 2 articles in the Herald Sun, the tabloid newspaper that employs him, which, it won't surprise you to learn, is owned by Rupert Murdoch. The main point of Bolt's 2 articles was that light-skinned people who identify as Aboriginal are not Aboriginal at all. He actually named 9 fairly high-profile Aboriginal Australians and accused them of using the system to their own advantage, as if there could be any advantage still in Australia to claiming to be Aboriginal. But that was what he said. His 2 articles, listen, one of the articles was headlined, "It's so hip to be black," and the other, "White fellas in the black." It was really embarrassing as a white person to read these 2 articles. But listen to this. The 9 Aboriginal women and men took him to court, and the judge ruled in favour of the 9, saying that Mr. Bolt had breached Australia's Racial Discrimination Act. Now, as you can imagine, there were great celebrations inside the court. Outside the court, however, Andrew Bolt claimed it was a terrible day for freedom of speech in this country. The opposition leader at the time, Tony Abbott, who, for our sins, is now our Prime Minister, warned against restricting, and I quote, "the sacred principle of free speech." But that's not the end of the story. When our current Conservative government, under Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, was elected to power in 2013, one of the first things they did, presumably in reaction to that court decision, was to bring putting forward an amendment to the Racial Discrimination Act to repeal the section that makes it unlawful publicly to offend, insult, humiliate or intimidate a person or group of people. The Attorney General, the highest law officer in the land, said that the government was acting in the interests of free speech. People do have a right to be bigots, he said. At the same time, the Prime Minister, our ultra-conservative, climate change denying, Tea Party-style Prime Minister, you think you have problems, he said with a slightly sanctimonious tone, "We want this country to be a nation where freedom of speech is enjoyed. And sometimes free speech will be speech which upsets people, which offends people." Now you see what he was saying? He was saying, we want this country to be a nation where the Andrew Bolts of this world enjoy free speech. And if those he targets with his racist opinions don't actually enjoy it, well, that's tough. That's what he was saying. Look, there's nothing fair about free speech that's not universal. There's nothing fair about free speech that's reserved for the favoured few. Now, in this paper I want to do two things. First, I want to look in some detail at the concept of freedom of speech as we have it today. Speech for some, silencing for others. Then, I want us to examine the task confronting us as radical feminists by asking, how can we push through the silencing to make sure our voices continue to be heard? What do we need to do in this 21st century to promote fair speech? That is, speech for all those disempowered by the free speech of the powerful. That's our task. Now look, I'll give you my answer to that second point right now, because it's actually in the title of my paper. What do we need to do as radical feminists? We need to speak. And our speech must be loud, bold, and fair. Now, see, you've heard the last point? Don't go home. It's not over. I want to now go back to the first point. Free speech. What is free speech? Okay. In the beginning, the idea of free speech was that anyone should feel free to express his ideas. And I say his because it was only men, middle and upper class men, who were seen to have ideas worthy of expressing. Any one of these men should be free to give expression to his ideas, and other men of quality should be free to agree or disagree, because the free exchange of ideas would lead to a healthy, more intelligent society. Now look, it was a very important freedom that was being called for. The power of speech that was once the purview of the king, religious leaders, lawmakers, and other powerful male leaders was to be shared by other men. It was a really important move. Of course, the subsequent idea of the universality of free speech is a reasonably new phenomenon. Men of more lowly birth, women, racial minorities, sexual minorities, all of us have had to fight long and hard to get anything like a chance to have free speech. And as we know, the battle is still being waged. Back then, however, it was a good start. But you know, there never has been agreement on how much freedom is involved in freedom of speech. There are those who adhere to the absolutist view. I can say and do whatever I like. I am free to be a bigot. I am free to insult and offend, and other people just have to accept it because that's what free speech is all about. Well, you know, it's interesting that absolutists often quote John Stuart Mill in support of their position, but they conveniently omit one of the most important things Mill said. He said, in declaring that individuals ought to have complete sovereignty over themselves, he went on to say, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised by the state over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That is, the only situation in which individual freedoms like freedom of speech should be curtailed is when the exercising of one's freedoms causes harm to others. The harm principle, as it's come to be known, promotes the need for fairness in our speech. So, there are those who insist on absolute freedom and those who call for the kind of freedom that does no harm to another person. Radical feminists, of course, who understand the politics of power and oppression and know that the world is not a level playing field, we adhere to the harm principle. We say fair speech trumps free speech. It's interesting to analyse those two words, freedom and speech. Oh, and I want us to do that. I'll start with speech. Very briefly, speech, in the context of freedom of speech, refers to the whole range of expressions. Verbal, non-verbal, writing, cartooning, satire. And Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin and other feminists spoke also of speech acts. That is, what one does with what one says, what our words do to others. This is really important too. It must be taken into account, radical feminists insist. Pornography, for example. When radical feminists criticise and protest against pornography, it's not because we're prudes, not because we want to deprive people of sexual pleasure, not because we are anti-sex, as they always say of us. It's because of what pornography does to women, what it does to all women. It degrades us, it subordinates us, it silences us in the sense that the speech of subordinated persons is never given much credence. Speech is about words, that's right, but it's also about the actions that flow from those words. Now, let's look at freedom. Freedom is something all enslaved people have sung about through the ages. I love that song written by Bernice Johnson Reagan, one of the original members of the African-American group Sweet Honey in the Rock. The song she wrote for African-American activist Ella Baker. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I just love that, you know, it's true, isn't it? We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And you know, back in the early days of second wave feminism, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, freedom was something that feminists wrote about, sang about, and protested about. I'm reminded of the songs of US feminist folk singer Carol Etzler. One of her songs starts off, all across the nation, all around the world, women are longing to be free. And then there was this one, until she's free, yes, until my sister's free, I'll sing a song of liberation. I'll raise a cry for liberty until she's free, yes, until my sister's free. Followed by another verse, until we're free. I'll sing a song of liberation. I'll raise a cry for liberty until we're free. Yes, until we all are free. So freedom was an important feminist theme, and now the word has gone the way of other words like choice, empowerment, and in more recent times, agency. To serve, now listen to this, to serve their own ends. Patriarchal institutions have taken our words, twisted them, and made them the exact opposite of what we intended. Whereas we used to use the word choice, remember that? We used to use the word choice to mean women have a right to choose what happens to our bodies. Of course we do. Whether we have an abortion or not, who to be with, who to have sex with, who to choose as our life's partner. Now, liberal and libertarian voices, including sadly some feminist voices, use the word choice to support activities and industries that degrade and humiliate women. Women have a right to be sex workers if that's what they choose, they tell us. Women have a right to choose work in the pornography industry. And of course, speaking out against prostitution and pornography as radical feminists do, we're accused of denying women agency. We're not giving women individual choice. So in their minds, it's all about individual choice, whereas for radical feminists, it's about the collective good, developing a healthy and just society. Empowerment too, not just choice, empowerment too. Individual women are empowered by prostitution, they tell us. Again, radical feminists are concerned with the impact the existence of prostitution has on women as a class. Freedom too, freedom has been co-opted big time. In today's neoliberal climate, the word freedom seems to belong to wealthy white males. Powerful multinationals, powerful politicians, powerful media moguls. They know, you see, that the word free has positive connotations in people's minds, that citizens are more likely to be on side with whatever decisions they make if they call something free. So they exploit it to the hilt. Look at free trade. We hear about it all the time. You see, there's nothing free or freeing for the majority of citizens about trade deals that are negotiated in secret by powerful politicians, multinational corporations, and financial institutions. I think of 3 deals, and you probably know about this. I think of 3 deals being negotiated right now. The first 2 will affect you, and the third will affect us in Australia. First, for you, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, being negotiated between the EU and the US. Do you know about that? Yeah. Have you heard in any detail about the terms of the TTIP? I bet you haven't, because they keep it as a secret, you see. The second one is the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement being negotiated between the EU and Canada. Again, the negotiations are all in secret. They're being undertaken with little, if any, input from the wider community. Then there's the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will affect us in Australia, being negotiated between several Pacific Rim countries, including the US and Australia. The same is true. We are told nothing about the terms of the TPP. And you know what? These are deals that could put our democratic rights, our food safety, our environmental standards, the price we pay for essentials like pharmaceuticals, all in the hands of corporations. Now that's scary. And to make it worse, it's most likely that companies will be given the green light to take governments to court if decisions governments make for the good of their citizens look like impinging on a company's profits. The world's gone mad, don't you think? The world's gone mad. Under a previous free trade agreement, the Australian government has already been taken to court by tobacco company Philip Morris. The German government's decision to shut down a nuclear reactor prompted legal action from a Swedish power company. Now look, we don't actually know if that provision will be part of the current deals being negotiated because the negotiations are going on in secret. And the powerful operators at the top are refusing to release draft texts before the deals are finalised. So they're going to do it all, and we just accept it. And we feminists know from past experience that whatever the impact is on ordinary people, it will be much more pronounced for women. We know that. Free trade, oh yes, free trade, but free for whom? Free speech, again free speech, free for whom? The theory is, about free speech, that in a democracy, all people are free to speak and have their speech heard and considered. But what we know is that speech belongs to the powerful. This is how it works. Powerful politicians, and you recognise this, I'm sure, powerful politicians, powerful business leaders, powerful media moguls talk to each other. and their speech is usually the speech of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the philosophy that maintains that the market is all that matters. There is nothing more important than the market, economics, profit, competition, winning, no matter who loses. These are the important things, not ethics, not human rights, they're not important, not a healthy ecological environment, not providing adequate funding for community services, not angsting over the increasing numbers of women abused and murdered by their male partners or ex-partners, not taking seriously the sexual exploitation of women and girls for the pleasure of men. It's all about the market. And we see that, don't we? We see that when we hear politicians being interviewed and so on. You know that that's their focus, is the economics. Free speech is the speech of the powerful, and they reserve it for each other. They speak and listen almost exclusively to each other. And after they've made decisions that will affect the lives of ordinary people like you and me, they condescend to let us know. We have the right to protest, of course, because we all live in a democracy. We have the right to protest, but usually their minds are made up, and more often than not, our protests fall on deaf ears. We are silenced by their deafness. A quote from Arundhati Roy comes to mind. She was speaking at the City of Sydney Peace Prize lecture. She was the person invited to give this lecture back in 2004, and this is what she said. We know there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And you know, as radical feminists, we are among the preferably unheard, and so we are deliberately silenced. And something else about the speech of the powerful. The really powerful patriarchal forces don't actually have to engage with activists like ourselves at all. They don't have to get their hands dirty because they are assisted by other men. Not so powerful men, pathetic men, really, whose commitment in life, it seems, is to silence radical feminist voices calling for fair speech. Men's rights activists, for example. Men's rights activists, they're not really interested in the rights of men. They say they are, but they're not. They're not interested in improving things for the men they say they're supporting. They actually exist for the sole purpose of spreading hate against feminists and, in particular, radical feminists. And I was, in Australia, I was on the receiving end of their hate speech in Australia for an extended period of time, and it's not fun. Then there are the no-platformers. Those men who, in this country, demand their own right to absolute freedom of speech by aggressively denying feminists our right to free speech. The cowardly act of no-platforming feminists like Julie Bindel, Janice Raymond, Sheila Jeffries, Germaine Greer, indeed anyone who disagrees with their narrow, self-serving view of the world, is fundamentally antithetical to the principle of free speech. But they do it, they keep on doing it. And a third group, the online abusers, are always with us. Those men, mainly men, who look for every opportunity online to abuse and threaten women, who dare to have an opinion. So you see, all of those pathetic representatives of manhood are out there every day doing the dirty work of those who have the real power under patriarchy. Their job is to keep us occupied with their grubby, destructive words and activities, so that neo-patriarchal neoliberalism, as Beatrix Campbell called it, can continue its work unhindered by the protests of feminists. Oh yes, we all believe in free speech, but the voices of women calling for justice and fair play are silenced. Now, I want to move on to the second point. Are you still with me? Yeah. Okay. How can we, radical feminists, push through all this silencing to make sure our voices continue to be heard? As I indicated earlier, my answer to that question is we must continue to speak, and our speech must be loud and bold and fair. So, our speech must be loud. Let's look at that first. I talk about our speech being loud. When I talk about that, I mean two things. I mean that we are to speak out loud and also to speak loudly. See, we women are notorious for silencing ourselves, for not speaking our thoughts out loud, keeping our thoughts inside our heads. We're notorious for that. And when we keep our thoughts inside our heads, it kind of affects us physically. You know that feeling, don't you? You really want to say something, keep it inside. That's what I'm saying. We need to speak our thoughts out loud. And of course, when we hear a more courageous woman say out loud what we wanted to say, we feel a sense of relief. At least it's been said. And I didn't have to put myself out there. But we need to speak out loud. Every individual one of us must push herself to speak her thoughts out loud, not wait for someone else to say them. We must speak so that we have the satisfaction of knowing that we ourselves are having an impact. Audre Lorde, you know the work of Audre Lorde, African-American lesbian feminist, writer, poet. Audre Lorde, writing in the 1980s, described how she felt when confronted with a serious health problem that had the potential to end her life. This is what she said. In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality, that I could die soon, what I most regretted were my silences. We do regret our silences, don't we? We do regret our silences. And the fact that patriarchy today uses so many tactics to silence women is no excuse. As individuals and as a group, we can and must refuse to be silenced so that our voices are still heard. Speak out loud and also speak loudly. In other words, don't be timid. Courage is required because radical feminists are positioned outside the system. Mary Daly called it living on the boundary. Living on the boundary of society. We are marginalised by society. And so what we do is we take up our position on the margins with pride. It doesn't mean that we don't work in mainstream jobs. That's important for our physical and economic survival. But politically, we are on the margins, speaking loudly, speaking proudly, speaking confidently and with conviction, insisting that our voices are heard. So, our speech must be loud, loud enough for people to hear, loud enough for those with the power to know that they don't have it all their own way, and loud enough for women who are victims of men's violence in all its forms to be assured that they are not alone. There are feminist voices committed to supporting them and advocating for them. So, we must speak out loud. Also, the second thing, oh, I've lost it now. Sorry. I'm trying to be 21st century. Oh, I found it again. I'm trying to be 21st century. I'm doing all right. Okay. The second point, our speech must be bold. Now, in order for our speech to be loud and bold, it must be different from the pop feminism or fad feminism that appears in the media from time to time. Now, I'm not criticising that today. If women feel moved to participate in slut walks or to take their gear off and parade half naked with slogans written on their bodies, so be it. It's somewhat superficial and largely apolitical. It doesn't coincide with my own radical feminist position, but I'm not inclined to invest energy in opposing it. However, radical feminist speech that is loud and bold cannot be superficial. It must be grounded in solid knowledge and analysis. It goes without saying that we don't have to do all the analysis ourselves, but we do have to make ourselves aware of the latest analysis and writing by other radical feminists on all the issues we fight for. Or we, individually, we can choose to specialise in one area and become a kind of expert on that issue. But this we know, it's impossible to speak boldly about something when we're unsure of our facts. So educating ourselves and honing our analyses must be constant activities of radical feminists. Also, in addition to being grounded in solid analysis, radical feminist speech that is bold must be strategic, must be targeted so that we don't waste our words. Now, in order to speak strategically, we need to remind ourselves that we have our own agenda. What are we on about? That's the question we have to keep on asking ourselves. What are we on about? What is our agenda? And we keep our agenda firmly in our minds when we are speaking boldly, rather than being put off course by the agenda of men's rights groups, the no-platformers and online bullies who, with closed minds and hate in their hearts, are doing the work of the more powerful systems we have in our sights. Their job, as I've said, remember this, is to keep us occupied, responding to the lies and hatred they spew out against us. But we mustn't waste our time and energy on them. Of course, we sometimes have to respond in an effort to try to counter the lies they tell about us, but as Janice Raymond and Julie Bindel said, both intimated in articles I read or listened to online, to do that is an annoying distraction from our real agenda. Radical feminism is not reactionary. Remember that. We don't exist to react to other people's criticism all the time. We are revolutionary. We have an agenda of our own, and we work to fulfill our own agenda of creating a better and fairer world. So, solid analysis and strategic planning give us confidence to speak boldly. Now, I hope you're still with me for this final point, because this is important. Our speech must be fair. A quick summary of fair speech principles would look something like this. Fair speech decentralises power, so it's not just in the hands of a few people. It decentralises power and aims for an even distribution of power. That's what fair speech is about. Fair speech fosters justice and fair treatment. Fair speech focuses on the common good and encourages cooperation rather than competition. And fair speech gives priority to quality of life issues rather than to profit. It's obvious, isn't it, that the principle of freedom of speech as we have it today has strayed a long way from these principles. Now, as feminists and radical feminists, we are committed to fair speech, but this doesn't mean, I don't want you to misunderstand me here, this doesn't mean that we want governments to move away from the principle of free speech altogether, because without free speech we wouldn't have the option of fair speech. We just want free speech that is fair. That's all we want, free speech that is fair. Now, all this sounds pretty reasonable, and I'm sure you're all agreeing with me on all of these things, but I want to say that ensuring our speech is always fair is more difficult than it sounds. In fact, it can be quite complicated. Now, I wonder if you would pause a moment and just consider the following take on free speech. I haven't got this all worked out yet, so I need you to really think about it, and maybe we can have it in our discussion time. In a democracy, the principle of free speech is meant to give individual people the right to criticise upwards. You know, to criticise and protest against decisions made by the state, by politicians, by those with more power than the rest of us. That's what democracy is about, that's what freedom of speech is about. So we're on safe ground when we criticise business leaders, the media, politicians, and so on. But the principle of free speech doesn't give us the right to criticise downwards, to criticise people who are less powerful than ourselves. Also, it doesn't really give us the right to criticise horizontally, to criticise people who are on the same level in terms of power as ourselves. We can do it, and we do it, there's no doubt about that, but that's not what the democratic principle of free speech was about. In fact, it could be said that speaking out against, protesting against people who are more powerless than ourselves can be an expression of hate speech. Men's rights activists, of course, taking every opportunity to criticise those who campaign against men's violence toward women, calling those women who are victims of men's violence and those who advocate on their behalf, calling all of them, all of us, liars, and saying that we should be punished, violated, or worse, that's hate speech. You see, these are men, mostly men, criticising downwards. That is hate speech. Again, those in society who demonstrate against mosques being built in their communities, or against supermarkets and stores that stock halal products, saying that Muslims should be driven out of our so-called Christian country. That's hate speech. Mainstream men and women demonstrating against members of a religious minority, ordinary, everyday Muslims attempting to fulfil the requirements of their religion. It's hate speech. The no-platformers that you're all so very well aware of, the no-platformers demonstrating their power over women, enjoying their ability to get patriarchy structures on side, to vilify and silence those women who say things they don't want to hear. That's hate speech. Men trying to silence women. But there are times when the power differential is not straightforward, and that's why I say that choosing fair speech over today's version of free speech can be complicated. Now look, in Australia, there's a group of younger radical feminists who operate under the name Collective Shout. I love them. They're just wonderful young women. They demonstrate against stores that stock clothes with sexist slogans on them, against the opening of nightclubs that have a reputation for requiring their young women employees to wear sexy clothing, to consent to lap dancing, pole dancing and so on. They demonstrate against our government's granting of visas to entertainers who sing or rap about raping women. And Collective Shout has really quite a bit of success in all these things. Now, all of this sounds exciting, except that it occasionally gets complicated in my mind. Take Tyler, the Creator, for example. Have you heard of him? I hadn't before Collective Shout started. But take Tyler, the Creator. Collective Shout was successful in having this 24-year-old African-American rapper's visa cancelled. But on the question of fair speech and criticising upwards but not downwards, were they right to do that? He's wealthy, African-American and male. Oh yes, we can criticise upwards because he's wealthy and male, but not downwards because he's a member of a racial minority in the United States that is still being targeted by racist white police and other white supremacist groups. Should we go easy on him and allow his misogynist, pro-rape, pro-violence against women lyrics to go unchallenged? Well, of course not. Of course we shouldn't go easy on him. But it is complicated. It's not really straightforward. What about an African-American man or a man from a cultural minority in this country who is just starting out, not wealthy by any means, indeed struggling to get out of the poverty caused probably by the colour of his family's skin, but he's beginning to get a following because of his sexist, misogynist lyrics. Is it okay to campaign against him? Well, of course it's okay, but it is complicated. The woman who works as a prostitute or as a so-called porn star to make enough money to feed and educate her children, does fair speech allow us to criticise her? It's complicated, isn't it? Yeah, the answer is yes, we do have the right to criticise her, but it's complicated. Well, this is the way I understand it. Radical feminism reminds us that our task is not to bring individual women and men to their knees. That's not our job. Our focus must be on the philosophies and the industries that encourage these individual people to think it's okay to sing about violating women, for men to use and abuse women's bodies for their own pleasure, to express racism and sexism in so many ways. We protest against the philosophies, against patriarchy as a philosophy. That's what we protest against. Against neoliberalism as a philosophy, against racial and cultural superiority, against men's inherent right to dominate women as a philosophy, and so on. That's what we are demonstrating against. Fair speech insists that we target the philosophies. And yes, the individuals caught up in all that will inevitably be hurt as well. But our criticism must be reserved for the underlying philosophy, and that goes for the industries too. We criticise and campaign against the pornography industry, against the prostitution industry, against fashion, advertising industries. We don't target individual prostitution or individual models used by the fashion industry. We may challenge their views. We should object to individual behaviours, but we target and oppose the underlying power structures, the underlying philosophies of patriarchy and neoliberalism. It's important, keeping our own agenda firmly in our minds, that we maintain our commitment to fair speech by protesting upwards against powerful political and business leaders, against industries, against repressive philosophies, and not downwards. In all that we do and say, our aim is to see that power is shared around. We foster justice and equity. We focus on the common good. We encourage cooperation and give priority to quality of life for all. Now let me finish with this. In these early decades of the 21st century, with neo-patriarchal neoliberalism running rampant, when we are faced with extreme efforts to silence our radical feminist voices, indeed to silence all voices demanding justice and fair play, when freedom of speech has been turned into a plaything for the powerful and a justification for almost anything, let history record that we radical feminists have stood together, refusing to be silenced, refusing to be timid, and that we have continually raised our voices on behalf of women and done it confidently and without fear. So let's be loud, let's be bold, and let's be fair.